Hello, I'm Justin Leavitt, and this is my presentation on the historiography of fairy tales for my History 643 class. This presentation will discuss the historiography of the fairy tale, focusing mainly on the European tradition. A comprehensive study of such a large topic will not be attempted. Instead, 6 books have been chosen that give a broad overview of the various schools of thought and the perspectives on the genre. 1928, what I call the structuralist foundation, I've chosen to represent with Vladimir Props the morphology of the folktale. He argued that different fairy tales have an underlying structure in common, which is the role or the function of the characters and events. Examples of this are the hero, villain, helper, task, resolution. Famous words that we all know when we learn in elementary school now. Nevertheless, they were groundbreaking when he did it. This provided a replicable scientific method for studying fairy tales. And his language and framework, as I said, have become household words. We all know them. A bonus fact, it was originally published in Russian, and there was no English version until 1958. So they had these ideas for 30 years before we did. And also, he never actually uses the word structuralist. He uses the word morphology. Um, but later on, everyone realized he created a structure, and as such, he is the father of structuralism, though he never used the word. There's the citation information. Next, we have 1976, what I call a Freudian psychoanalysis, represented by Bruno Bettelheim, on the uses of enchantment. He argues that fairy tales are important in helping children process their unconscious fears, desires, etc. He talks that about the fantastical elements actually create a processing safe space, is what I've chosen to call a safe space, meaning because it's magic, because it's not real, it's okay to think about these things without feeling the emotion of them. For example, Cinderella deals with death of family members and with sibling rivalries in a safe way. He contrasts with Prop. He focuses not on the form, but on the meaning of the fairy tale as a whole. And it has come to be known as the universalist perspective, which assumes that these themes are universal, they transcend culture, and that all children from all over the world understand these universal themes. Bonus fact: he was one of the first to study fairy tales in connection with other subjects, such as psychoanalysis, whereas Prop just studied fairy tales. And he was highly regarded in life, much less so after death. After he died, some things about his behavior came to light, which threw a long shadow over his work. Nevertheless, it's still considered important. In 1985, the feminist perspective, which I've chosen to represent with Pamela Berger, the goddess obscured transformation of the grain protectoress from goddess to saint. She argues that female pagan goddesses became Christian saints, losing prominence in the process, which reflected broader societal and cultural shifts. An example is that the pagan goddess Brigid, after the Christianity became Saint Brigid of Ireland. Now, this is not fairy tales per se, but it's relevant because this is culture and religion and folklore after all. And she discusses the female roles and subjugation, which is mirrored in fairy tales and in the roles in fairy tales, of course. A few bonus facts. She shows how cultures can adapt without abandoning their older beliefs. They can become Christian and still keep what they used to believe. And this was an interdisciplinary approach. She mixed cultural, religious, feminist criticism all together in this book. Which brings us to 1992, a cultural look at childhood. I've chosen Maria Tartar's Off with Their Heads, Fairy Tales and the Culture of Childhood, to talk about the cultural look at fairy tales. She argues that the brutal imagery in fairy tales teaches children moral lessons through gruesome consequences. She does not avoid the gruesomeness. In fact, she goes right into it deeply. She adds to the feminist work by Berger and others. She discusses how the roles of women in fairy tales reveal gender stereotypes. For example, you have the honest, helpless Cinderella who is duly rescued by a man, while the birds peck her stepsister's eyes out for dishonesty, showing both the helplessness of that role, but also the consequences for bad behavior. Gruesome. Bonus fact: though she's not a psychoanalytic critic, she does agree with Bettelheim that fairy tales provide a safe, controlled way for children to engage with the more frightening aspects of life. So there's an agreement on that front. 2009, the revisionist, what I call a shakeup. Ruth Bottgeimer, Fairy Tales, A New History. She argues that fairy tales began not in oral traditions, but Renaissance literary works. She refutes nearly all the previous work on the origins of fairy tales. For example, she says that the rags to riches story, achieved through magical help, uh, was the beginning of the fairy tale tradition. She names Giovanni Straparola from 1550 as the creator of the entire genre and actually traces the history of the genre from northern Italy to Grimm up in Germany and then to Perrault in France. Bonus fact: this caused many folklorists to reevaluate their assumptions on fairy tale history, sparking a new wave of literature on that subject. 2012, The Interdisciplinarian Strikes Back. Forgive the Star Wars reference. I've chosen to show this by Jack Zipes, The Irresistible Fairy Tale, The Cultural and Social History of the Genre. This was part of that backlash, if you will, against Bodiger. Um, he takes an extremely in-depth look at fairy tale origin and purpose, including cultural, social, Marxist, and feminist elements. He rejects universalism, arguing that fairy tales are constantly changing, reflecting the values of that host culture. An example is he says that fairy tales function as memes or units to transmit culture. And those who know the internet know that memes and memology changes all the time, and it does transmit cultural ideas with incredible efficiency. He discusses how fairy tales reveal a culture's socioeconomic status, which was a new look in many ways at fairy tales. And as a bonus, Zipes openly criticizes modern institutions, Disney in particular, for sanitizing and commodifying, in his words, fairy tales, which he says strips them of their meaning in many ways. And so, in conclusion, while extremely short for this topic, I hope this presentation has provided a broad overview of the schools of thought and perspectives on fairy tales. It is fascinating that something as innocuous as stories told to children can have such meaning when examined closely. But then, that seems to be the case with many things in history. Thank you for watching my presentation.